all my shows got canceled. I kind of found myself stranded in Portugal, and I mean, my hosts at that residency were extraordinarily generous and supportive, and you know, they told me I could kind of just stay there as long as I needed to. Yeah, I was really hesitant to come back to New York. It's horrible what's happening here. It really should have been avoidable. I feel very lucky in a lot of ways, even though, you know, my life has been put into some degree of disarray. There are people in the States who are much more vulnerable. So I actually did this crazy thing where I have a car, and my roommate and I drove into Times Square a few nights ago. And what we found was just, I've never seen anything like it. It was Times Square on a Friday night at about 11 o'clock. And it was completely empty except for homeless people and some cops. It was really the closest thing that I've ever seen to like a zombie apocalypse. The idea of that piece was that I wanted to, even though I'm in isolation, even though I'm stuck inside, I'm always kind of like thinking about what's happening elsewhere. My approach is less is more. I always come from sort of like an organic place. My first method is to take my instrument and try to, through the use of extended techniques, like tease out certain sounds that I think are interesting. And then from there, further try to like filter the sound with like one or two plugins. So I'm going to give a little demonstration of the way that I approach processing acoustic instruments. So here I have a Venu. It's a Carnatic instrument from India. It's a wooden flute, and I don't really play it in the typical way. I like to just kind of move my breath through the instrument and do some electronic processing to bring out the kind of textures and interesting little subtleties of that sound. So what you're gonna hear is a bit of my processing. So I had one microphone that was pointed out of the window, and then I had another microphone that was on my flute. It's an Octava MK12. It's a vintage Soviet microphone. It's a condenser. Has 3 different polar patterns, so you can really use it for a lot of different things. I have a pair of these, and I find them very fabulous. So I was processing the flute with some plugins in Ableton, and then I was sort of pumping the sounds coming from outside of my house into the improvisation, so I could kind of, react and play with what is happening outside. And for that particular take, there were a couple sonic elements that were happening outside that were really appropriate. One was sirens in the distance, which are pretty much a permanent fixture in the soundscape here. And the other one was a helicopter that was flying overhead. So it was kind of about, in real time, mixing these elements coming from the diegetic sound of outside with, an improvisation. I was also using tape collage, so a lot of what I do with electronics involves tapes. So I have microcassette recorders that I manipulate and layer and collage into big squalls of noise. I'm going to show you the way that I go about doing tape collage. So I use these little microcassette recorders. They're very available through eBay or at yard sales. They're old dictaphones, so they were originally used for recording voice, but they're very lo-fi, and the way that you can manipulate them kind of unleashes some wonderfully awful bursts of noise. So I'm gonna be working with these recording from Rio de Janeiro. I was there this past year for a festival, and I made some recordings at a botanical garden there. So there's a lot of playground sounds and birds and kind of ambient ephemera. So I'll show you how I go about making that. I like to use field recordings. It's, a pretty tried and true method in experimental music for many years, of recording the sounds of your environment and reconsidering those as music in and of themselves. The way that I like to approach it is I like to use a lot of layers, a lot of overlapping parts to create a sort of dense field of sound. A lot of what you heard in the performance was tape recordings of Rio de Janeiro. I was there in December for a festival. They commissioned a new piece from me, and in that piece I recorded sounds from all throughout Rio, from the botanical gardens to a 600-person samba to street markets, Ipanema Beach, and everywhere in between. I used those recordings on tape as like a collage element. So I really love the feeling of when I travel, the world becomes, because I'm not familiar with it, these are new setups, these are new scenarios that I find myself in. Everything sort of becomes interesting, and I can listen and look at the world around me in a different kind of way. The visual element of this video is a collaboration with my roommate / quarantine mate, Bradley Eros, who is an experimental filmmaker, and he works very heavily with expanded projections and old school celluloid, so 16mm, 8mm film and slides. You know, this is kind of the cool thing about this moment, is that we have that freedom to experiment. You know, hold ourselves to like a rigorous standard of creative production. And it's not always about like making something that can like be out into the world. I think that process is really important. So we all have this time now to like cultivate a deep process. It can be meditative and it can be cathartic. So it can actually like really help us through all this grief we are collectively experiencing.